Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I want to share with you the books and resources we are using for a poetry main lesson block. Now my daughter has requested this main lesson block. She really enjoys poetry, both reading it and writing it. So I've collected some of our poetry books as well as some new resources that I want to share with you. Now I don't have a lesson plan on this yet. Primarily we want to read through these books and then write our own poetry. However, I want to share with you first off this book called Time to Rhyme with California Native Plants and Animals, written and illustrated by Fatima Mohammad, because this poetry book actually comes with a workbook guide, and I'm really excited to include that into our unit because it's going to help us create our own poetry and illustrations inspired by this book. So this book is written by a 9-year-old, she might be 10 now, child, and I really love her poetry for a couple of reasons, which I will share. And what I'm really excited about is utilizing the work guide or the worksheet guide or the curriculum. There's a name for it and I can't remember what they called it, but I'm really excited to include that because it allows us to have some direction with our unit, and it's going to allow us to create some poetry using the tips that this young and extremely talented poet has to share with us. So the reasons why I like this poetry book, the first thing is that I find poetry a little bit challenging personally as an adult. And when I've read poetry for adults, I sometimes get lost in it. But when I'm reading poetry that's written by children, it can still be profound, but I enjoy it a lot more because I can relate to it a little bit better. I enjoy the verses, the way that it's written. And I've read maybe just a few books, or rather I should say a few selections by young poets, and I've just really been drawn to it. Additionally, this is my friend's daughter, and so I am even more pleased to share with you her work. And then the other thing about this book is that she has done all of the illustrations. Now they're all black and white here, and you could certainly color this in, but if you buy the workbook guide that comes along with this book, then you can print off those sheets and color them in, or you can use them as a guide to create your own illustrations. So this is also going to be especially appropriate for us being in California, because it's going to talk about animals and plants that you're going to find that are native to California, and more specifically Southern California. I still think that it's valuable no matter where you are, but if you are in California or Southern California, then I doubly recommend this resource. Now, in doing our poetry unit, I didn't want to just do poetry, I also wanted to do some biographies, and so I have two books here that I think are going to include a little bit about the poet's life. And the first one is called Robert Frost, Poetry for Young People, and I purchased both of these books, this one and the one on Emily Dickinson, a while ago, and they never made it into any of our main lesson blocks until now, so I'm really excited to include them. We did read one or two poems from each of these books, but we didn't include them into a main lesson block, and this way we'll be able to get through a lot more of the content that these books have to offer, because I'm dedicating a certain amount of time for this unit, and currently I am scheduling about 2 weeks for this unit for our active lessons, with an additional 2 weeks for my daughter to continue writing her own poetry, which she does anyway, and to illustrate it, but most of the content we'll get through within 2 weeks. Okay, and also this one's really beautifully illustrated. In that series, you can also find Poetry for Young People, Emily Dickinson, and the beginning of the book does have a little bit about her life, so about 4 pages in tight font, and so it seems like it'd be pretty dense, and then a selection of her poems as well as illustrations. And I particularly like Emily Dickinson and her poetry. We also have Poetry for Young People Carl Sandburg, and I think this is set up the same way. However, I purchased this one from a library bookstore for maybe 25 cents or 50 cents, and it's been in our homeschool library for quite some time, and now we're finally going to be able to use it. And I'm less familiar with some of the poetry in here, so I'm excited to make this something that I am learning right alongside with my daughter. So I've got 3 books that I want to share with you that were inspired by other homeschoolers. Lindsey over at Mama Schmooze Reviews shared some of these poetry books, and so you can find her YouTube channel linked down in the description box below, so you can head over to her and say hi and thank you. So this first book is called Joyful Noise, Poems for 2 Voices, and I'd never seen books like this before where you have 2 people reciting the poetry, and that totally delights me. I can't wait to do this with my daughter. And plus, I love these illustrations. They are so whimsical and kind of silly, and they are reminiscent to illustrations that I can't place right now. I want to say maybe frog and toad type illustrations or wind in the willows. There's something kind of familiar about these illustrations. So anyway, I'm excited to include these with my daughter so that we can each read. I believe that's how you're supposed to do it. Read the parts that are intended for each person. Also, my daughter has joined a drama club this past year, as well as a poetry club, and she's really enjoyed drama a lot. And I think that this will be a nice way to bring drama and poetry together with these poems that you read aloud. And I do believe I learned that poetry is best listened to, read aloud, rather than just read silently. So Messing Around on the Monkey Bars. This is another book that has poetry for 2 voices. I'm less interested in these illustrations, but my daughter is really enjoying this book. So we've already set a lot of these things up in our homeschool room on one of the areas that I have dedicated for our unit studies. So she's already asking me to read these as part of our opening activities for our current unit, and then she's just reading them on her own and then reading them to me. So this is another one where it is for 2 people, and you can see that the text is written regular and then in bold so that you can each see which part you're supposed to read. And this would be really nice to also memorize. That way you're not both sharing the book, but that you can both recite it from memory. A Visit to William Blake's Inn. This is another book that I saw on Lindsey's channel, and I don't know much about it, so I'm excited to read it along with my daughter. So I don't know that there is anything that's biographical in the beginning, so no. So for some of these, it will just require me just to do a little internet search before we begin, just so I have something to share with my daughter on these different poets, especially ones who have written a lot and are notable from the past, and not to diminish poetry that's more current, but there are some poets that are just world famous universally. That was a little redundant. World famous. Okay, so the next book I want to share with you is my favorite poetry book. This one's called Plum by Tony Mitton, but it's also illustrated by Mary Grand Prix, and she is the illustrator of the original Harry Potter books. And so if this looks familiar or her illustration style looks familiar, they are both the same illustrator. I love this poetry book so much, not just because the illustrations are incredibly rich and captivating, but the poetry itself is so much fun. Not every single poem is something that I love, but most of them are ones that are so fun to read aloud. There's some poems that for me, it's a struggle to read aloud. But then there are others, like the poetry in this book, where it's such a delight to read them aloud, the way that they're written, or the way that you can add your own sort of melodious tones to them, or the way that they rhyme just brings a lot of joy to the read aloud experience. And so this is a book that we've read in our homeschool for years, and my daughter probably wouldn't have asked to include it in this poetry main lesson block, but I did because I We've read them so many times, but I wanted to include it as well. My daughter's favorite poetry book is called Shaking Things Up, 14 Young Women Who Changed the World. This one is amazing. I absolutely love it. Now, we don't actually like the dust cover. It's a completely different image on the dust cover versus the hardback book. We love this illustration so much that we just took off the dust cover. So if you're looking for it, the cover looks a little bit more like this. No, actually it looks like this. This is what if you're online looking for the book, this is what it's going to look like. It's not going to look like this. So I love this poetry. All the poems are written in a different style, and I'm not sure if they're all the same, if they're written by the same. Yeah, so they're written by the same person, but it looks like the illustrations are all by different people. Okay, and the other thing is that it's historical. So you're learning a lot about these women. So they're biographies in poetry with these beautiful illustrations, and you're learning so much about each of these people. I love it so much. If there was only one book, okay, 2 books that you decide to add to your poetry main lesson block, it would be this one and this one. So if you could only just do the 2, those would be the 2 that I recommend. So I wasn't going to include any of the Shel Silverstein poems or poetry books. We have 3 of them. We've read all of them. My poor book has seen better days. We've read all 3 of them to my children. However, primarily I was reading these with my older 2 children and a little bit with my 3rd children, but my daughter actually missed reading these 3 books cover to cover. We have read individual poems, but we haven't read them cover to cover. In the past, these books would make up some of the content for our opening activities. I would read 1 poem a day as part of our opening activities before we started our main lesson for the day. And this was just a really fun way to include some poetry on a daily basis. And because there are so many poems in these 3 books, I think it took us a year and a half to get through all 3 books by just reading 1 poem a day. And then once we were done with all 3 books, we revisited the poems that we loved the most and then read those ones often after that. Okay, so I don't know how we're going to include this one into our unit, but we'll find a way. So the last book I want to share with you, and then I've got a couple other resources here, is this book that we do not have the dust cover for anymore. It's called A Treasury of Flower Fairies, and these are the poems that go along with these stunning illustrations. This is an older book, and I know it's been reprinted. You can find versions of this, and I love, love, love the illustrations so much. She's really been enjoying these poems, and every now and then she'll ask me to read one of them to her, and so she requested that we add this book into this unit, and so we will read these. And she also loves doing her own illustrations with these poems by either photocopying the book and then coloring it in, or just coloring her own illustrations to go along with these poems. So the last things I want to show you are a couple of notebooks. This is my daughter's notebook where she writes down her poetry. So I'm going to not share with you her poetry because that's personal for her right now and I didn't get her permission, but she has a little poetry notebook here where she will just write down all of her poems. And so we're going to have this as a means for her to write that down. They're lined pages and they're small, but for her it's just right. But we also have these 2 notebooks that we made a year ago, and they're easy to take apart because they just have the rubber band, and we will put in to these notebooks our final project, our final poems that we have worked on and mastered, and then the ones that we love the best. Then we'll add into these little journals that we made. These were inspired by the book Worms and something else like earthworms. That book is linked down in the description box below if you would like to see it. The author of that particular book is also a homeschooler, and she had some projects and information in that book, and one of them was a project for a nature journal. So these were originally made as nature journals, which now we're going to repurpose as our poetry journals. And I can't remember which one my daughter picked. I think she picked this one and I picked this one, and we're just going to add in our favorite poems at the end of this unit. Okay, so I think that is it. I hope you enjoyed this look at the materials we're using for our poetry unit. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more information. You can find that link down in the description box below. You can check out the playlist of our poetry books and other activities that we're doing by tapping on the screen. That link is also in the description box below. And if you'd like to see what kind of poetry we're reading on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram at Pepper and Pine.